Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the inquiry hearings. I'm very glad to say that with the relaxation of the COVID restrictions, we're now able to invite members of the public to come and see our work. And so we look forward to hearing and seeing those who may want to come and hear what we're doing over the next few days and weeks. Today we're going to hear evidence from Dr. Barbara Lane, one of the experts instructed by the inquiry. So if Dr. Lane's there, would you ask her to come in, please? Why have I got so many screens? Good afternoon, Dr. Lane.
Hello.
You're going to take the oath, I think.
Yes,
is that right?
Yeah.
Right. You take the testament in your right hand and read the words on the screen, please.
Okay. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Do sit down and make yourself comfortable, please. Yes, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, members of the panel. Dr. Lane, good afternoon to you. Thank you very much again for attending the inquiry on, I think, what is your fifth occasion to assist us with your opinions. My questions are intended to be short and simple. Sometimes they don't turn out that way. So if you want me to rephrase the question or put it in a different way, please just ask me. Also, if you need a break at any point other than the scheduled break that we'll take during the middle of the afternoon or so, please let us know.
Yeah.
Now, you've prepared a report for Module 3 of Phase 2 of the inquiry entitled The Management and Maintenance of Grenfell Tower. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it's broken down, I think, into some 11 chapters.
Yes.
What I'm going to do is just read the chapter numbers and references into the record so that everybody can find them if they need to. So bear with me if you would. The first is BLARP 25023, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, and its application to high-rise residential buildings. That's chapter 1 of your report, isn't it?
That's correct.
And chapter 2, is this right, is at BLARP 25024, organising and planning a system of management that provides the fire safety arrangements required by the RRFSO, or RRO, as we shall call it.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then 29, BLARP 25029, the fire safety arrangements made by the KCTMO, that's chapter 3, yes?
Correct.
Then is it right, chapter 4 at page 30, KCTMO's duty to provide protection measures to support the means of escape, fire doors?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, correct.
Then chapter 5 at 31, page 31, KCTMO's duty to control the hazards from building works and alterations.
Correct.
Yes. And then at BLARP 250's page 34, KCTMO's duty to provide adequate fire protection for vulnerable persons. That's chapter 6.
That's correct, yes.
Chapter 7 is at BLARP 250's 33, KCTMO's duty to provide a suitable system of maintenance for fire protection measures.
Correct.
Yes. And then chapter 8 at BLARP 250's 27, the adequacy of the advice provided by the fire risk assessor, Carl Stokes of CS Stokes and Associates Limited to the KCTMO.
Correct.
Yes. And then chapter 9 at BLARP 250's 28, KCTMO's duty to create a system of emergency planning, the resulting emergency plan for Grenfell Tower, chapter 9.
Correct.
Yes. And then chapter 10 at BLARP 250's 32, the external wall construction, the hazard it posed to relevant persons.
Yep, correct.
Yes. And then finally, chapter 11, conclusions at BLARP 250's 40.
Correct.
Yes. Now, you have had cause to revisit the number of individuals that you have counted as vulnerable in chapter 6, I think, since you wrote that report.
Yes, that's correct.
And as a result of your review, is it right that you've increased the number of adults that you've counted as vulnerable?
That's correct.
Yes, and that will be set out, I think, is this right, in a second version of Chapter 6, Section 14, which will be finalised soon and disclosed to core participants.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes, thank you. Apart from those amendments to those aspects of Section 14 of Chapter 6 that you propose to make in due course, are the factual matters set out in your report true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Yes. And can you confirm also that the report sets out your true and complete professional opinion on the matters that you've addressed in it?
Yes, it does.
Yes. And can you confirm also that you've understood your duty to the inquiry as an expert to the inquiry and that you have complied with that duty?
Yes, I have.
And in particular, have you given the evidence and opinions set out in your report in the same ways that you would to a court and abided by the same principles?
Yes, I have.
Now, your report stands as your evidence to the inquiry. Having addressed some matters of context, my questions are going to focus principally on those matters which, in respect of your report, are truly ones of expert opinion, and where there have been material developments in the evidence given to the inquiry since your report, or reports, as well. And I'm going to focus on the points of relevant controversy. Do you understand?
I think so. Well, am I allowed to ask a question? Sorry. So when you say expert opinion, you just my normal opinion here
Yeah.
based on the work I've done.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Yes,
sorry.
exactly.
Okay. Understood. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Now, can I start by asking you some questions about your qualifications and
Yes.
experience?
Yes.
You've given some details of your relevant qualifications and experience
Yes.
in the introduction to your Phase 1 report in April 2018,
Yes.
paragraph 1.1.
Yes.
I'll just read the reference. That's BLAR 701, page 6.
Yes.
And to that report, you appended your CV as Appendix A
Yes.
at BLAR 6016. I'm going to look at that in a moment. Before I do, I just want to read another document into the record. You've given us a further document, which is at BLARP 25041, which sets out your current roles at Arup and your specific experience in respect of fire risk assessments. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Now, before I go to that document, I want to ask one or two questions about your CV, which you appended to your Phase 1 report from April 2018.
Yes.
That's at BLAR 6016. Can we have that up, please? There's page 1. Can we go to page 5? And on page 5, which is taking a little time to come up. Page 5, thank you. You'll see the heading, Current Arup Roles.
Yeah.
And in the first paragraph there, it says, Director of OVE Arup and Partners Limited, Global Fire Safety Engineering, Technical Leader for 228 fire engineers, 83 of whom are based in the UK.
Yes.
Is it right that from April 2021, this year,
Yes.
You were no longer carrying out those roles?
That's correct. I have a whole new set of roles in
New
Arup.
set of roles.
Yeah.
And we'll look at those in a moment. To what extent did those roles that you've identified there on the page we're looking at involve carrying out fire risk assessments under the RRO?
Well, it's as I've set out in my latest, more specific fire risk assessment CV.
Right. So those activities fell within the scope of your role as a director?
No, sorry, no. So as my role as a fire safety engineer working on projects,
Right.
I carry out fire risk assessments.
Thank you. I see.
And regardless of any corporate role at Arup, so I have new corporate roles at Arup now, I still work on projects as a competent fire safety engineer.
Yes. And to what extent did those roles, in relation to fire risk assessments particularly, involve quality assessment?
So my experience of quality assessment is both as a project director for projects at Arup for fire safety engineering projects, where we call it's our own work, so where the fire practice has a commercial project on its own. But I also do quality assurance checks, and I'm involved in project reviews and more extensive reviewing as a director of the firm on multidisciplinary projects that Arup would produce. And in the last 2 years particularly, because I was a member of the region board of Arup, it's like a management executive really, I was responsible for advising the COO, who is our responsible person, on how to comply with his duties.
Right. I see. Now, can we go to BLARP 25041, which is the further document that you've now provided? to us. We'll just have the first page of that up. BLARP 25041. That's the first page there. Can we go to page 6 in that, please? And if you look at the top of that page, you can see that it says current operational roles at Arup Group Limited. Since 1st April 2021, my operating roles in Arup and Partners Limited came to an end, and I commenced new operational roles for the Arup Group Limited and have various new responsibilities in that regard. And then you've set them out underneath that.
Yeah.
To what extent do those roles that you've set out there involve carrying out either carrying out or quality assessing fire risk assessments?
Oh, quality assessing fire risk assessments. Okay, so it's important to, all my fire work is done as a project director in project director in Arup Fire, and that's an additional role to my they're quite senior corporate roles.
Right.
Okay, but I have quite a substantial role. I wasn't planning on talking about that today, actually, but in the roles listed here, by being the director of the Arup University, I'm responsible for the learning provision, the skills provision, and knowledge transfer processes in the whole of the Arup Group, which is the UK and the whole company. And I also have responsibility for certain risk zones in our own risk profiling exercise for our own business.
Right. And does that role in the learning provision, skills provision and knowledge transfer process, does that include knowledge and understanding of how to carry out a fire risk assessment under the RRO?
Yes, it does, because we have a large number of fire safety engineers, and I myself am a full-time fire safety engineer.
Yes, thank you.
So I hope that's, I'm not entirely sure I'm answering your question.
Yes, you have.
Okay.
Thank you. And we can answer it further, I think, by going to page 4 of this document,
Okay.
if we can. If we go to the introduction, page 4, in the 4th paragraph down, you say, I have been carrying out, do you see?
Yeah.
I've been carrying out fire risk assessments since my career started at Arup in 1997, and have latterly also been responsible for the detailed checking and approval for issue under our quality management system for fire risk assessments produced by staff at Arup also.
Yeah.
Now, just one question on that. You say latterly you've been responsible for checking and approving FRAs produced by Arup staff. Since when and in what role have you been doing that?
Well, the more senior you get, the more work of others you become responsible for rather than just self-check. I have no idea what year I became a formal approver at Arup. It's a very long time ago.
Right.
I can confirm the year somehow.
So when you say latterly, when are you referring to? Do you just mean after 1997?
No, I think I was just trying to communicate that your role, your responsibilities expand beyond your own work only, where you are very intimately involved, and increasingly there's an expectation and a requirement to also, on top of your own work, your own projects, to also make sure the work of others is fit for purpose. So it wasn't meant to mean I did one thing and now I'm doing another. I do both, but my responsibility for other people is much more than it was when I first started work.
Yes, I see. It's just I wanted to understand what you meant by latterly there. Do you mean recently?
Well, I wish I hadn't put that word in now, because it wasn't meant to have a great meaning other than the more senior you are at Arup, the more work of others you are responsible for, and that requires a proper understanding of what a quality assurance system is and being able to utilise it.
In any given year, in the period to which you're referring there, how often would you check and approve an FRA produced by your staff?
I have no idea. I would say to you, not at a public inquiry endlessly,
right?
But I don't know how many. I have no idea. I work very long hours, endlessly, checking and approving the work of others, and being responsible for the very complex risk assessments I do myself.
You're likely to give a similar answer to my next question,
okay.
So forgive the question.
Yeah.
If you go down to the next paragraph, you say, since 2009, I've spent the substantial portion of my professional time working on existing buildings, refurbishments, and therefore occupied premises, including construction sites within occupied premises. In particular, since 2011, the majority of my professional time was spent on projects within the framework of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 and equivalent legislation. As I say, forgive the question, but what do you mean by the substantial portion?
Okay. So I was just trying to make the point there. So I think I'm aware that there's this perception of Arup and Arup Fire that we specialise in design and, say quite theoretical work. And I wanted to make the point here, because I'm aware, of people querying my expertise. I wanted to make the point here that I personally have, as I understand it from other people, quite unique experience, because I've done so much work in construction in occupied buildings and on refurbishment and providing advice to clients where it's in the occupied building condition, not in those really early stages when one deals, particularly with an architect. So I just wanted to draw that experience that I have out.
Yes, thank you. Now, in the last paragraph on that page, you say, my experience spans across multiple sectors and includes both public and private sector clients. I've selected projects below where I had a particular role in fire risk management system analysis, as well as technical fire risk assessment activity in premises with a sleeping risk and with vulnerable people. Now, do the selected projects that you've listed, and we'll come to those in a minute, represent the totality of the projects where you've carried out that activity, or only a selection, a proportion?
They don't represent the totality.
Right. Can you give us some idea of the proportion?
No, I've never sat down and calculated it. I'm really sorry.
Now, let's look at page 7 then, and some of those selected projects. If we go to page 7 of this document and go to the heading 2011 to 2017, portfolio of multiple high-rise residential dwellings buildings. It's the second section down. It says, independent review, fire risk assessments 2013 to 14, independent review of existing fire risk assessments, including the significant findings and action plans, production of a new full fire risk assessment for each building based on a detailed inspection of the active and passive fire protection measures. Again, forgive the question in light of what you've already told us, but can you tell us roughly even how many fire risk assessments you carried out on high-rise residential buildings before the 14th of June 2017?
I've no idea. There were 17 buildings here, for example.
So no idea because it's a lot. Is that the
Well, I don't know if it's a lot by other people's standards, but I think I've worked on very many high-rise residential buildings. Actually, I probably should just say something. I don't think the number of is important. It's more the complexity and the work that I did. I don't agree that chugging things out makes you more experienced or competent.
No.
So I'm not able to confirm. If someone needs me to do an analysis of everything I've ever done at Arup and confirm percentages, I'm happy to do that.
No, that's all right. If you go to page 9, please, you've listed 2 projects at the top of the page there. 2012 purpose-built blocks of flats, England South Coast. And 2012 to 2017 purpose-built block of flats, England Northwest. Can you just clarify what work you were doing on those particular projects?
The one in 2012 was to do with the construction of the single escape stair and how the relevant persons were utilising the public spaces available in those buildings, as well as complex matters of fire doors that had various defects to them. I'm just trying to think what else. I think that was about the extent of that.
I see.
Yeah.
And what about the second set of buildings? Is that the same?
That was to do with the external wall, the structure of the building, and the vulnerability of the persons living there.
Right. What was it about the external wall? Do you recall?
I very much recall. I think the best way to describe it here is that it was a very poor construction standard. There was no ACP or anything like that, just to be absolutely clear. It was of a very poor construction standard, and combined with serious concerns about the overall structural stability of this purpose-built blocks of flats, in combination with problems with faulty internal compartment walls, faulty fire doors, and a few other issues. Altogether, it was quite an extreme situation.
Did those projects involve carrying out fire risk assessments for the purposes of the RRO?
Absolutely.
They did.
Yeah.
Have you carried out fire risk assessments on existing purpose-built blocks of flats, such as Grenfell Tower?
I have never carried out a fire risk assessment on a block of flats built in 1971, no.
You say built in 1971, that's quite a specific...
Oh, sorry, no, sorry, that wasn't meant to be sinister. Yeah, no, no, I haven't.
Right.
Yeah, but I think that I've carried out very many risk assessments on all different types of buildings, and I think I'm very familiar with residential buildings, and I'm not aware that there are different rules for different types of residential buildings.
Yes. Now, I'll just mention this rather than taking you to the part of your report. In your report at Chapter 1 at paragraph 1.2.2, I better show it to you.
Yeah.
This is a quotation. It's at BLARP 25023, page 8. You say at paragraph 1.2.2 there, 2/3 of the way down the screen,
Yeah.
now halfway down the screen, you refer to Mr. Todd's reference and reliance on PAS 79/2012.
Yeah.
And you say this includes carrying out fire risk assessments of high-rise residential buildings with combustible materials in the external
Yes.
wall construction. Can we take it that you're very familiar and have, in your work, been very familiar with PAS 79?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Is PAS 79, or rather was PAS 79 as at June 2017, the leading guidance for fire risk assessors when carrying out fire risk assessments?
I think it's the most robust publication available to people carrying out fire risk assessments to get a really clear understanding of what needs to be done. And I tend to rely on it as a checklist or, quality check of my own work to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. And I really like the risk level estimator, particularly in PAS 79.
Right. So would you say that any fire risk assessor who relied on it wouldn't be going far wrong?
What would I say? I think that there's no, I don't think using a pro forma as presented in PAS 79 automatically means that that one can then add on all sorts of very positive effects. I think it's one part of the work needed to produce a fire risk assessment.
My question wasn't designed, I think, to elicit whether or not it was an adequate checklist exercise, but simply that the principles contained in it are principles which, if followed, meant that you wouldn't be falling into error as a fire risk assessor.
No, I think that it describes the classic 5-step health and safety risk assessment process in a much more, expansive way for fire risk assessments.
Yes.
And if you do what it says and don't think any further, most of it will help you get there. Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's helpful. Can I then turn to a different topic, which is the duty to undertake a fire risk assessment and its purpose? Do you agree that Article 9.1 of the RRO imposes a requirement on the responsible person to make a, quote, suitable and sufficient, unquote, fire risk assessment?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Now, the term suitable and sufficient is not defined in the RRO, is it?
No.
No. Do you happen to know where it comes from?
Well, my understanding of where it comes from is, I think it's from the management regulations. And when I try to understand what that means for me, I always refer to the general health and safety publications written by the HSE. They tend to give advice about what suitable and sufficient could mean, but there's nowhere where there's a formal definition of it.
When you say the management regulations, do you mean the management regulations promulgated under the health and safety legislation?
Yes.
Before the RRO came into being?
From memory, I think it's, I just because I don't have everything in front of me, it's definitely in 1999, and I think it's in 1992.
Yes.
I'd need to check.
Thank you. Now, given that the term suitable and sufficient isn't defined in the RRO, how would a responsible person go about working out whether its fire risk assessment is suitable and sufficient?
Yeah, I think so. I think the easiest way to do that, probably the easiest way to do that, is to use something like PAS 79 as a check. But there's always a certain portion of, premises-specific issues that the responsible person and the fire risk assessor will have to exercise, judgment beyond the checklist in PAS 79.
Yes, thank you. Would you agree that a fire risk assessment done by or on behalf of a responsible person should give consideration to the matters, each of the matters, set out in Article 4 of the RRO?
In Article 4.
Well, let me give you a shopping list.
Yeah.
Measures to prevent the outbreak of fire.
Oh, the general fire precaution. Sorry. Okay, I don't whiz around the articles.
Sorry.
So will you just ask that question again?
Yeah. Would
please?
you agree
Yeah.
that a fire risk assessment done by or on behalf of a responsible person
Yes.
ought to include, first, measures to prevent the outbreak of fire?
Yes.
Yeah. Second, compartmentation, fire stopping, and fire doors.
Yeah, measures to, sorry, yes, it needs to look at it. Sorry, I don't actually really understand what you mean.
I'm really just seeing
Yeah.
if we can agree the scope of
The scope. So are you asking me about protection measures that a fire risk assessor should look at when trying to deal with Article 4?
Let me try it differently.
Sorry, yeah.
Would you agree that Article 4 would include
Oh, yes.
looking at compartmentation?
Yes.
Yeah, and looking at fire stopping,
Yes.
looking at fire doors.
Yes.
Yes, and then the rest of the list would include things like emergency escape lighting.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Fire exit signage.
Yes. Certain places. Yes.
Certain places.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Smoke control.
If it's there. Yes.
If it's there. Fire extinguishers.
Not normally in public areas. Again, it depends what's in the building.
Right.
Yeah.
Fire detection and fire alarm systems.
It depends where it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Appropriately disseminated fire safety procedures.
Yes.
Yes. And instruction and training of employees in fire safety,
Where relevant.
where relevant. Arrangements for the management of fire safety.
Yes.
Yes. Have I missed anything out?
But,
All right.
Well, I'm afraid to say yes
may
or
have
no.
done.
Yeah. So obviously, I think on a more serious note, I think I've been very clear in my report about the basic principles and then the more detailed
Yes.
protection and protective measures I would expect and I've relied on.
Forgive me for saying this, and I should have said this at the beginning, but
Yeah.
your report is, of course, quite long, and some of the questions I'm asking you are really designed to summarise for people listening to this exercise,
Yes.
what's in it so that they can
Understood.
understand it.
And my report's very long because I was given such extensive evidence to review. Yeah.
We are very grateful for every word.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Now, on those matters on the shopping list that we've just discussed, should they be specific to the building under assessment? In other words, you take your building you're assessing and you go through that list.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit like when we were speaking about PAS 79. I think every building is meant to come equipped with a set of fire safety provisions. So say you take whatever's been provided under the building regulations, whatever year that was, and you need to understand what your building specific fire safety provisions are. They're not the same in every building, even across residential buildings. So it's important to understand this premises specific information.
Yes.
And that's why the pro forma in PAS 79 is useful, but there may be something else for your building that you have a duty to notice and include.
Yes, thank you. Now, bearing in mind PAS 79 and its contents, and for the technicians here, specifically, as yourself, page 18, clause 5, Roman 1, we don't need to look at it. Do you agree that a fire risk assessment should do four things, particularly? First, express the current level of risk.
Yes.
Yes. Second, determine the adequacy of existing fire precautions.
Yes.
Third, determine the need, if any, for and the nature of any additional fire precautions.
Yes.
And fourth, then set out any additional fire precautions required in the action plan.
Yes, I do, yeah.
Would an FRA need to do anything else in order to be in order to count as suitable and sufficient, do you think?
Again, sorry, I'm just struggling a little bit with what you mean. I mean, it needs to explain all sorts of different things like the evacuation plan, explain about the fire safety management system. Is that what you mean? So there's other features beyond physical features,
Right.
Yeah, that a fire risk assessor has to consider.
I see. And you say that includes fire risk safety management.
Yeah, so so there's the physical aspect of the work. You go to the building, you see the fire safety provisions, so what the building comes with, how it's being used, what hazards are introduced by the use of the building, and then there's non-physical matters to do with fire safety management and, how these matters are dealt with.
Yes, I see.
Yeah.
We're going to come to fire safety management later in your evidence,
Yeah.
but I'm grateful for that addition to the list of things I've referred to. Can we then turn to the question of competence of fire risk assessors to carry out FRAs? Again, do you agree that under Article 9.1, indeed any part of the RRO, there's no requirement, there's no specific requirement that a fire risk assessment should be carried out by a specialist?
By a specialist?
Yes. A specialist fire risk assessor, for example.
That there's no requirement to appoint what's a specialist?
Well, someone who knows how to do a fire risk assessment.
Okay, well, that's a different matter, isn't it? So I think that the use of the word competent isn't used in the order in the article about fire risk assessments. I think if that's what you're asking me, and it is used elsewhere. I don't know why I'm just struggling a bit about why legislation would ask for specialists anywhere.
Well, you've answered both of the next questions I had.
Okay.
I think you agree there's no provision in the RRO which requires that an FRA should be carried out by a competent person.
I can only agree that the article dealing with fire risk assessment makes no mention of the word competence.
No, that's right. Do you
Well,
know...
it does use the word suitable and sufficient, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, yeah.
And it might be an interesting matter for debate whether they, in turn, assume the existence of a degree of competence necessary to carry out a suitable and sufficient risk assessment.
Yeah, and I was very interested in your exchange on that, actually. We were talking about cooks and puddings that you can accidentally produce. And it's actually quite a serious point, though, that can an incompetent or someone with less competence than somebody else, classified as having extreme competence, end up producing a suitable and sufficient risk assessment? And the answer must be probably. But I think where competence comes in is as a function of the hazards in the building and the type of building you're looking at. The less competence there, the less likely it is you will find all the relevant hazards, which is the main point of carrying out a risk assessment. So I think it's about maybe likelihood of missing something, as opposed to, I suppose I can turn the argument around. Can a very competent person end up producing a risk assessment that others will conclude was not suitable and sufficient? And the answer is yes.
Can you just help me with this, since I've interrupted your
Sorry,
flow?
yeah.
It occurs to me that if you're going to assess the risks relating to fire,
Yeah.
you're going to ask yourself, what are the risks of an outbreak of fire?
Yes.
What is the possibility of controlling a fire if it does occur?
Yes.
And what are the prospects of escaping from a fire if you can't control it?
Yes.
Is there anything else that you're looking at at the overall level?
Yes, there is. So I think that's the fire scenario side. So what in the building can cause a fire to occur in the first place? Where will the fire spread?
Yeah.
How does that impact the people? Okay. How it impacts the people, and so what type of evacuation may be available to them, is a function of your understanding of what, the building regulations, separate legislation, but it calls fire safety provisions. So what's in the building that's meant to make it safe when the fire has broken out and if the fire is spreading. So as well as those fire scenarios, you can't determine that spread and, consequences without understanding what the building itself is capable of in those scenarios.
Well, that has a bearing on the ability to escape from a fire, I assume.
Absolutely. Yeah, it has it has a bearing on how you escape, and the likelihood of being able to. And it also has an impact on firefighting as well, noting that, yes, I understand that that's separate, but it impacts what's possible in those scenarios.
Thank you.
Can we go to CTA 6011, please? And what I'm showing you is the competency criteria published by the Competency Council in, I think, 2011. This is part of Mr. Todd's report. If we go to page 109 in that document, this is the foreword. And yes, it was published on the 21st of December 2011. And if you go to the second paragraph under the foreword, you can see that it says there's no legislative requirement for the fire risk assessment to be carried out by a competent person. This is to avoid an implication that every duty holder under the legislation needs to employ the services of a fire safety specialist, such as a consultant, to carry out their fire risk assessment. Now, despite the fact that the duty holder is not obliged, it seems, to retain the services of a competent fire safety specialist, is it the case that every fire risk assessment must be carried out competently?
Yes, it is. Am I allowed to say something about that sentence there, please?
Yes.
I think my experience of working with different organisations is some of the best risk assessments and fire risk management systems come when there's a competent person embedded in the organisation, because there's that bit of what really goes on every day in an organisation and in a building that's really important. Okay, so I don't know why it kind of goes from one extreme to the other, that there's no competence, so you don't need to employ a specialist. I don't understand why it's so linear, that description there.
Right. I see. Because, of course, there is an obligation to have a competent advisor, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
A competent person within the organisation.
Yes.
So you say that there's an inconsistency there, is there, between...
Well, I don't understand why we go from it. I don't understand why you don't need competence to do a fire risk assessment, and you are required to have competence to do any other risk assessment. And I've made it clear that I don't understand that. But I don't understand why that triggers this phrase about needing a specialist. and having to employ someone from outside. That's all. I don't think it's a big point.
Right, okay. In a high-rise residential building, would it be normal, in your experience, for a fire risk assessor, I call them a specialist, someone who does it a lot, to be instructed, or would it be normal for the responsible person to take on that obligation or that function itself?
Well, I think I've seen both. I mean, so sometimes I'm brought in, to review what's going on, okay? Right. And I can't speak for the thousands of people carrying out this work,
right. Would you expect anyone undertaking a fire risk assessment, whether it was the responsible person itself or on its behalf, to meet the standards of the reasonably competent fire risk assessor as contained in PAS 79 and in these criteria?
In PAS 79, and which criteria here? The one on this page, sorry. Oh, down at F, the FRAC, the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council.
Yes, the one that's on the screen.
Yeah. I think, yes, I think that would be a fair and reasonable thing for a responsible person to do.
Right. Other than the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council criteria published in December 2011 and PAS 79 published in August 2012, other than those two documents, is there any other guidance document that you would use to determine or enforce competency on the part of a fire risk assessor?
Enforce competency. I mean, I think they're very well established. I mean, I think I think there's helpful guidance on competency generally from the HSE. I quite like how they describe competency.
Right.
Okay.
Now, forgive the generality of this question next, but in light of some of Mr. Todd's evidence, I feel bound to ask you, do you agree or disagree that PAS 79 applies to fire risk assessments of high-rise residential buildings such as Grenfell Tower?
Well, I very much thought it was.
Yes. Are you aware of any parts of PAS 79 that were intended to apply only to commercial premises?
I don't know anything about that. I mean, I'm a practitioner. I read the document, I apply it, I ignore parts where it's not relevant to my work. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a perfectly appropriate document to use for any time I'm doing a risk assessment.
Let me try this a different way. During your time as practitioner, up to and including June 2017, or even today, for what it's worth, were you or are you aware of any understanding or any view in the fire risk assessment business that when it came to high-rise residential buildings, there were some parts of PAS 79 that should be treated either as wholly inapplicable or applied with less vigour than if the building were a commercial building?
I don't know anything about that.
When you say you don't know anything about
I've never heard that, but I'm very uncomfortable kind of representing people I've never met.
No, but I'm asking you about what...
No. So in my work and in the work of all the people at Arup and the other people that we engage with, including work that we have to review, that's not a theme that I've ever had to tackle.
Yes, and I think that answers my question, which was, were you aware of any view floating around the business that there were bits of PAS 79 that simply either didn't apply to high-rise residential buildings or you could sort of treat as secondary?
Yeah, but so I haven't heard that, but maybe someone else would come in here and tell you they heard it every day. But in my working environment, that's not something I've ever been aware of or had to deal with.
My recollection is that Mr. Todd was of the view that PAS 79 had been drafted principally with commercial buildings in mind, and that in his view some parts of it were not really very appropriate to residential buildings. Is that something on which you can comment?
Well, I think that if an author of a document thinks that they should say it at the front. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm being a bit, I would like to know that as a user of the document. In terms of exercising my own judgment and independent thoughts, when I've used PASS 79, I've never reached a point where it fell down for me when I was risk assessing anything. I find it a very good method to assist me in my work.
And following on from that, can I just show you what you say in Chapter 8 of your report?
Yeah.
Can we go to BLARP 25027, page 60, paragraph 5.5.12? You say there, in my opinion, PASS 79 2012 provides the most comprehensive guidance on action plans. Therefore, I have used this document as the benchmark for my later assessments.
Yeah.
One or two questions flowing on from that. Do you agree that a fire risk assessor could use the template in either Annex B or Annex E to PASS 79, depending on whether they were carrying out a new FRA or an FRA review?
Yes, I could.
Yes. And if the format varied, they would need to make sure, is this right, do you agree, that all the correct recommendations of the current PASS 79 were satisfied?
Yeah, because most people, I mean, I went back and had a look at things coming here. Most people actually adapt it because to make a premises specific. Yeah.
And now, following on from that, given that a fire risk assessor isn't required to use any particular template but makes it premises specific, would you expect that for FRAs on Grenfell done after August 2012, the reasonable fire risk assessor would have used the 2012 version of PASS 79?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And is it fair to say that there would be, if he or she did not use the 2012 version of PASS 79, but an earlier version, there would be a risk that the fire risk assessor would not necessarily be following the most up-to-date British standards or industry guidance?
They're not enormously different. I can provide a comparison, but I think it's a sign of keeping up to date on things, which is a very important part of actually demonstrating competence to other people, even if not to yourself, that you are aware that such a significant document has been subject to a revision.
Yes, thank you. Now, I want to ask you some questions about other guidance documents published relevant to the conduct of fire risk assessments, which you've referred to in your report at Chapter 8 at Section 5. Would you expect Mr. Stokes, as the fire risk assessor on behalf of the TMO for Grenfell Tower in the years 2010 to 2016, to have a reasonably thorough knowledge of, and I'm going to give you a list. First, what we call the sleeping guide, namely HM Government Fire Safety Risk Assessment Sleeping Accommodation, published in 2006.
Yes.
At RBK 3036722, yes?
Yes.
Yes, you would. The second document, would you expect Mr. Stokes to have a reasonably thorough knowledge of the HM Government Guide entitled Fire Safety Risk Assessment Means of Escape for Disabled People, published in March 2007?
Yes.
INQ 3014732. You would. Third document, the Lakors Housing Fire Safety Guidance on Fire Safety Provisions for Certain Types of Existing Housing, published in 2008.
Yes.
Yes. CST 402516. Next document, the LGA Fire Safety in Purpose-Built Blocks of Flats, published first printed in July 2011 and then reprinted without the error a little bit later that year.
Yes.
HOM 45964. And then finally, would you expect the reasonably competent fire risk assessor during that period for Grenfell Tower to be familiar or reasonably familiar with the relevant British standards? So, for example, British Standard 9991 2015.
Yes, and probably more so the British standards for the systems in the building.
So including lifts?
Yeah, all the different types of systems and all the guidance documents refer you to those other standards.
Yes, I see. Thank you. Now, can we just look then at the LGA guide? And I want to ask you about where it sits in the pantheon, if you like, of guidance. Can we go, please, to your Chapter 11, BLARP 25040, page 7? And here, at paragraph 3.1.5, you say, at section 5.1 of the LGA guide, it states that with respect to purpose-built blocks of flats, it, quotes, builds on the advice given, unquotes, in the HM sleeping accommodation guide, but it also states 2 paragraphs later at section 5.3 that the LGA guide is, quotes, the more appropriate guide to use for purpose-built blocks of flats. And if you go on the same page to paragraph 3.1.7, 2 paragraphs down, you say, I have found no other publicly available evidence that fire safety risk assessment sleeping accommodation was superseded by the LGA guide, which is not an HM government publication, and therefore that the HM government guides no longer applied to purpose-built blocks of flats with respect to Article 50. And then if you go on to page 68, go back to chapter 1 at BLARP 25023, page 68, paragraph 5.1.24, you say, I consider it reasonable to expect responsible persons and their safety assistants to have considered HM sleeping accommodation guide fully, not just the LGA guide in isolation, nor as a primary reference source. Now, I've shown you what you've said in your report there in those places. Having heard the evidence in this part of the inquiry thus far, do you maintain the opinions that you've set out in those parts I've just shown you?
Yes, I do.
You do. Now, let's go then to the LGA guide at HOM 3045964, page 14. And there's a heading, which... next to the section 5, relationship to other guidance. It says, in the second line, it builds on the advice given in the DCLG sleeping accommodation guide mentioned earlier, and that's what you've quoted. And it goes on to say, that guide applies generically to all premises in which people sleep, but for purpose-built blocks of flats, this guide is likely to be the more appropriate guide to use. One to use. And if you go to paragraph 5.3, 2 paragraphs down, it says, this present guide covers all purpose-built blocks of flats, both common parts and the flats themselves, including those within the scope of the DCLG and Lakeall's guides. It is therefore the more appropriate guide to use for purpose-built blocks of flats.
Yep.
Now, in light of those express statements in the LGA guide, can you help us understand why it wasn't reasonable for any fire risk assessor conducting an FRA in the period 2012 to 2016, after the publication of the LGA guide, on a block of flats in general needs housing, to have regard only to the LGA guide on the basis that it absorbed everything of relevance in the DCLG and Lakeall's guides? Why was it unreasonable for a fire risk assessor only to use this document?
Okay, well, if we're talking about Grenfell Tower, all the guidance documents were referred to, so it's not relevant. If you're asking me to give a view on lots of other people and what they did, which I've told you I'm not comfortable doing, again, I've gone back and looked at all different documents that are available to me, and what I see is most people list out all those guidance documents and then state they've had to implement. That is my experience.
Right.
And I understand the language written here, okay? But it does not say to me that I must ignore everything else.
Let me try.
Yeah.
Thank you, and I understand that. Let me see if
Yeah.
I can get an expansion on that a little bit.
Yeah.
If a fire risk assessor assessing a building such as Grenfell Tower in the period 2012 to 2016
Yes.
used this guide, the LGA guide, only, and didn't use or look at the other guidance, such as the sleeping guide,
Yes.
would he or she be falling below the standards of the reasonably competent fire risk assessor?
So that didn't happen at Grenfell, okay? If a person read the LGA guide only, it still refers them out to all the different British standards and all the different things. You can never, in my opinion, simply read the LGA and carry out your work.
So I think the answer to my question is that if you did only read the LGA and carry out your work, you would be falling below the standards of reasonable competence expected of a fire risk assessor.
I think I'm being asked to give a view on a published guidance document as if that's what the focus of my work was. The focus of my work was on Grenfell Tower. I think the LGA guide document is a summary of lots of different publications with other opinions there. And in my professional opinion, it requires a careful reading and a careful assessment with other published guidance documents.
Would you criticise a responsible person or a fire risk assessor for using the LGA guide as essentially what I might call a one-stop shop and nothing else?
If the resulting risk assessment contained items that I considered to pose a risk to life, or I considered to be, from a technical perspective, not in compliance with the order, yes, I would.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, turning to a totally different topic, well, not totally different, relatively different, the scope of an FRA and practical steps, including evidence gathering and frequency. That's what we're going to look at next, Dr. Lane. First, can I show you, and I'm not going to read it all out, but can I show you chapter 11 of your report at BLARP 25040, page 5. And I'd like just to show you what's on that page under the heading the RRO at paragraphs 2.1.4, 4 paragraphs down. You say one central question which emerges is whether the external wall is within the scope of the duties set out in the RRFSO.
Yeah.
And you proceed after that to set out down to subparagraph 14 on the next page, if we could just turn the page, your opinion there that the external wall of a building with a stay-put policy or stay-put strategy falls within the scope of the RRO. Now, and I'll show you what you do say expressly at paragraph 2.1.14. You say, from that perspective, the KCTMO should not have omitted the external wall construction from its assessment of risk, as it was so interlinked with the safety of relevant persons in Grenfell Tower and because Grenfell Tower relied on the stay-put strategy. Am I, in understanding your evidence, do I summarise it correctly by asking you that the gist of that evidence, or your opinion, is that the external wall constitutes a collective protective measure for relevant persons in any building with a stay-put strategy?
Yeah, so any building where the compartmentation abuts the external wall,
Yes.
it means the external wall is... So when the internal compartmentation abuts the external wall, as you know, the external wall in high-rise buildings is a fire safety provision. It has a section in the building regs, just as internal compartmentation has a section in the building regs. And so where you rely on the protection afforded by the internal walls and the external wall for your evacuation, it is a collective protective measure.
Can I just understand that a little bit more closely?
Yeah.
On your last answer? You say that the external wall in high-rise buildings is a fire safety provision and has a section in the building regs.
Yes.
Just as internal compartmentation.
Yeah.
Could you just explain what it is about the building regulations that makes an external wall a protection measure?
No, so I wasn't trying to imply some kind of... That's a different way of saying it. So what I was trying to say is, I said a while ago, as a fire risk assessor, you have to understand what's in the building and then what happens when the fire starts. And I wanted to make the point that the external wall is one of the fire safety provisions that comes with a high-rise residential building. So it has to perform to a certain standard.
No.
Okay?
Yes. So
when you get under the order, so I don't want everyone saying, oh, she said the building regs equals this. That's not what I mean. When you get to the order and you're doing your risk assessment, you should be able to rely on that external wall to perform as intended when considering, how the compartmentation, where it abuts that wall, how reliable it is when you're going to continue to rely on also the stay put strategy. Okay? And it's a collective protective measure.
Yes.
Because the whole purpose of stay put is that once the people who have to leave, and there's always a cohort of people that have to leave, it should be safe for everyone else to stay. And that means the compartmentation they rely on, and I'll just keep using this phrase, where it abuts the external wall, it becomes reliant on it that performing.
Now,
okay?
just to be absolutely precise, when you say the external wall is a fire safety provision,
yes.
Do you mean that it has fire safety rules about it, including B4, the functional requirement in B4, and Section 12 of ADB?
Yes, there's it's a fire safety provision, and the rules are correct as you've described them, okay? And it's part of the package. So when you design a high-rise residential building, no matter what decade, the external wall has always been, assigned a minimum performance because it's a provision in high-rise residential buildings. It's part of the package of safety measures. And I think Miss Menzies is always really good at explaining about the interconnectedness of things, okay? And the external wall has always, in high-rise buildings and high-rise residential buildings, it has always been a fire safety provision and something that's relied upon in high-rise residential buildings.
I see. So just to clarify, for it may just be me, but
yeah.
Can we agree that the external wall is not itself a component part of the compartment, but itself has regulations applying to it?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Sorry. Yeah, so that's true. Okay.
Right.
That's correct. And because remember, it depends on the layout of the space. So at Grenfell, all the flats were on the perimeter. There will be other premises where you have landlocked compartments that don't abut the external wall, okay? So when the internal compartmentation, hits the external wall, together, in those circumstances, you are reliant on the performance of the wall as well in that capacity.
So perhaps can we summarise your opinion like this, that the external wall is relevant to the fire safety and the risks attendant on it of the external wall is relevant to the fire risk assessor because it is relevant to the maintenance of compartmentation?
Exactly, because without it, the internal compartmentation can't carry on. So I'm not saying an external wall is a compartment wall, because that has a really formal definition.
Yeah.
But when the internal compartmentation meets the external wall and the six-sided box, I've been kind of going on about this since the very start,
yes.
Where they meet together, one is reliant on the performance of that wall in maintaining this overall compartmentation strategy to allow people to stay in their flats and not be forced to evacuate.
Yes.
Okay, probably I'm not being clear now. But,
no, that's very clear.
Yeah.
So does it follow from that it was your view, and is your view, that the external wall falls within the scope of the obligations imposed on the responsible person by the RRO when it comes to the fire risk assessment?
Yeah, so the internal walls and the external wall, where they're relied upon for protection, by definition in my mind, that requires consideration in a fire risk assessment.
Now, you may have
Can you just
heard...
help me with this, because I think
Yeah.
I'm having a little difficulty. I'm just thinking of the external walls at Grenfell Tower before the refurbishment.
Yes.
You had concrete spandrels,
Yep.
which were, by definition, not combustible.
Yeah.
And between them, you had window spandrels or window pieces,
Yeah.
which were not fireproof and were either composed of glass and fittings or infill panels,
Yeah.
which may or may not have been very substantial.
Yes.
Now, in the case of a fire within a flat,
Yes.
depending on its severity,
Yeah.
that part of the external wall would be likely to fail very quickly.
Yes.
So,
Potentially, I'm just struggling to remember what the infill panels were made from originally. I thought it was some kind of asbestos type material. But anyway, I can't remember right now.
I'm not very sure.
Anyway,
but I don't think
yeah.
the window
Yeah.
sections were regarded as you say, as part of a compartmentation or as a non-combustible.
Well, it's the
Piece.
glass, it's the glass
Well,
part,
exactly,
and
the
it
glass-
breaks quickly.
The glass
Absolutely.
will go very quickly.
Yeah.
So you haven't got any form of real fire protection on the outside wall, have you?
Yeah. So it's correct. So it's not a compartment wall, which would require fire-rated glazing.
Right.
Okay. But what it's meant to do is to not, promote substantial spread of flame beyond that flat. So I'm not saying that there will not be a fire breaking out of the first flat, okay? But the idea is that it doesn't promote fire spread to multiple other
Right.
compartments.
So
okay?
would it be fair to say that, in your view, the fire risk assessor should be interested in the external wall to the extent that it might promote fire?
Yeah, exactly, that it's become a hazard. So, and you've actually touched on something really important. So when Stay Put was created, the rules for the materials in the external wall were totally different, okay? So you might say, in a way, you didn't need to think about it. Okay, or that you might call that not suitably insufficient, but if you didn't think about it, you were more likely, it was probably more likely to be okay because the wall was not a hazard. So in my mind, and I've been very as clear as I possibly can in my report. I understand everything that's written down. I know what I did and I know what was happening. But when you think about the wall in a building with a stay put strategy or other buildings with very complex evacuation strategies, you need to know if the wall is a protective measure in some form or if in itself it's become a hazard in the event of a fire.
Well, that I do understand.
Yeah, sorry, okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the view that you've just expressed in answer to the chairman's question just now, namely that, and I hope I've summarised it correctly as follows, that the fire risk assessor should be interested in the external wall at least to the extent that it might promote fire. Was that an approach or view that you heard in the industry generally from your work? In other words, was that a commonly shared view to the best of your knowledge and experience?
So all I can say to you is that my experience is from 2013, I was being asked by people with existing buildings and experiencing difficulties on my own projects with the hazard the external wall posed. And that's all I can say.
Now, let's look then at that opinion against the question of what I'm going to loosely call common parts. Can we go to BLARP 25023, page 5? And this is chapter 1 of your report. And let's look at paragraph 1.1.11 towards the middle of the page, now a third of the way down your screen, and you say this: the RRFSO expressly excludes premises defined as domestic premises, such as flats. Common practice became, therefore, to consider areas outside the domestic premises as so-called common parts, quotes unquotes. I deal with this later in section 6.2. And if we look at section 6, chapter 1, can we go to page 76, please, of this same document? You say there, at paragraph 6.1.5, I'm aware, for example, that there is a body of opinion that because external walls are not within the common parts, nor part of a workplace, by these definitions, the external wall falls outside the scope of the RRFSO. I do not agree. Are you referring here, when you say there's a body of opinion, to a body of opinion before or after the Grenfell Tower fire, or perhaps both?
After.
After. Right. Are you able to assist us with how, in your experience or knowledge, that body of opinion grew up after the fire?
No, I can't assist you.
You can't. When you say body of opinion, was that the body of opinion, to the best of your knowledge, held by the majority of fire risk assessors in the industry or other people?
I can't say that.
Right.
Yeah.
For example, whose opinion was it? Do you know? I mean, was it government?
Well, as I went on to do in chapter 10, I looked at the FIA document.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
I see. Are you able to explain the rationale for that opinion?
No.
No. No, we know you disagree with it.
No, well, I can't explain it at all. But, I mean, I feel like I'm straying a little bit off me having analysed Grenfell Tower, which is why I'm here.
All right.
But I hope that the technical information I've provided, and we might hopefully get to talk about the order a little bit more, I haven't been able to retrospectively prove that the external wall was right to be excluded.
No, I see what
I've
you
done
mean.
a double or triple negative there, but I haven't been able to prove that, no.
No, thank you. And in fact, taking that a little bit further, isn't it right that both the Sleeping Guide and the Lakers Guide, and indeed the LGA Guide, all said in their different ways that the RRO applied only to the common parts of blocks of flats or common areas?
Yeah, so I think that is true. That's absolutely correct, but that doesn't remove or directly cause the omission of looking at a hazard. I think.
Yes.
So it's kind of hard to explain this actually, but a hazard is a hazard in a building, and I can't find anywhere that any type of wall was expressly categorised as being in or out.
Right. Before the fire, was there a body of opinion, to your knowledge, that the external wall was or should be excluded from the scope of a fire risk assessment because it wasn't outside the private dwelling or pertinent there too?
I was surprised to hear that,
Right.
and I think we were surprised to hear that, I can say as well.
Right. So is it your...
I mean, I understand. I mean, I don't want to sound, I think there's always that kind of remark about hindsight. I understand what the guidance document said, and I'm absolutely clear that explanations of what the external wall is for in a high-rise residential buildings are omitted from all the guidance documents. I mean, it's important to make that absolutely clear. There is no explanation of the external wall as a fire safety provision and the importance of it, particularly in high-rise residential buildings, just for balance. So I'm clear that none of that was expressed.
Yes. I mean, you know that because you're familiar with the RRO, that by virtue of Article 6 and the definition of domestic premises, domestic premises are excluded from its scope, except parts used in common.
Parts of the domestic Yes.
How do you square your opinion that the external wall is a or may present a hazard which should be assessed with the exclusion of domestic premises, save parts used in common and parts
well,
of
I think
there too?
So my understanding of the RRO as a fire safety engineer is it actually splits things into three types of, I don't know if the right word is demise or not, but you have domestic, workplace and not a workplace. That's how it goes about things in the order. And I understand the domestic premises are excluded with respect to hazard and control, but I don't understand how that makes the external wall or the internal wall outside the scope. I don't understand how you immediately go there.
I think some people might say that the external wall isn't part of the common parts and therefore doesn't fall within the scope
Understood.
of the RRO.
But the RRO doesn't say, please do a risk assessment in the common parts. The RRO asks the responsible person to deliver general fire precautions by means of protective and preventative measures depending on the type of responsible person they are, for workplaces, not a workplaces, and yes, exclude the domestic premise. I understand that. But it doesn't say, please carry out fire risk assessments in the common parts and exclude external walls and include internal walls. Because I think it's important to also realise now that, I tried to look at all the ways common parts are referred to. The same is true of the internal wall. It's not included because the wall is the workplace. It's included in that risk assessment because it's a protective measure. It's one of the fire safety provisions in a building.
I see.
Okay, is that, because I know this is very controversial subject, so I hope I'm being clear enough.
I just want to understand your understanding before the break. Can I just see if we can leave it this way?
Yeah.
That you include the external wall as within the scope of a fire risk assessment because it's part of the protective measures which fall within Article 4.
Yeah, exactly. I can't.
As opposed to not
exactly.
being outside the
I can't say to a client, we've sorted out your general fire precautions for this high-rise residential building. I haven't looked at the wall. Here's hoping it doesn't cause extensive fire spread. Because the truth is that if extensive fire spread can be supported in a wall, not all external walls are a hazard, okay? But if it supports fire spread, I'm unable to say to the responsible person, the classic evacuation strategy remains suitable. I may have to change my evacuation strategy because I can't rely on that wall.
Yes, thank you. And that actually takes me very neatly to my next question and the break.
The break before your next question?
Yes.
There we are.
Yes.
We'll have the break now. We'll come back, please, at 25 to 4. And I've said this to you many times already, please don't talk to anyone.
I don't talk to anybody anymore. Yeah.
No, very wise. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you. 25 to 4. Would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Thank you. Oh, look, it's gone. Right, Dr. Lane, happy to carry on?
No, yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lane, can I look with you at the LGA guide, please? HOM 45964, page 111, paragraph 72. And under the heading, external fire spread at 72.1, it says, and I'll just read it to you, the external facades of blocks of flats should not provide potential for extensive fire spread. When assessing existing blocks of flats, particular attention should be given to any rain screen or other external cladding system that has been applied and to facades that have been replaced. And then 72.2 says, the use of combustible cladding materials at extensive cavities can present a risk, particularly in high-rise blocks. Restrictions are normally applied to the nature of such materials and in particular their surface spread of flame characteristics. Cavity barriers are also required in some circumstances. Assistance from specialists may be required to determine if the external surfaces of walls are satisfactory and whether there is adequate provision of cavity barriers. Now, just looking at that and reminding ourselves that that is the LGA Guide 2011, who was it who was supposed to assess, using the word there, existing blocks of flats and pay particular attention, using the words there, to any rain screen or other external cladding system?
Yeah, so I think this is a perfectly sensible warning about a hazard emanating from the construction industry. And who was it? Well, the reader of the LGA guide, and so the responsible person and their in-house or out-of-house fire risk assessor. Actually, sorry, Mr. Millett, is it okay if I just say something else? Because I was thinking over the break about walls.
Yes, of course.
This thing about in and out. So if the common lobby in Grenfell was landlocked, so it doesn't touch the external wall, but other buildings, the common lobby, you know, again, abuts the external wall. So by that definition, does that mean those walls are in and not other external walls? This is where I couldn't square the whole thing away in the end.
Yes.
I know you can't answer that question, but I think that's something that should be considered. Does what I've said make anything?
Yes. So
Yeah.
to take that
Yeah.
point and perhaps bring it back to you, are you saying that the external wall would represent a hazard or may represent a hazard to be assessed by the responsible person
Yeah.
and or their fire risk assessor, whether or not it abuts a compartment or a common part?
Exactly,
Yes, I see.
exactly.
Thank you.
Sorry. So back to this. This is a sensible warning about a hazard because of a trend in the industry.
Yes, that's very helpful. Now, on the basis of the answer before last, the responsible person or their in-house or out-of-house fire risk assessor is supposed to do the assessment. How were fire risk assessors, before 2017, how were fire risk assessors meant to incorporate their knowledge of the building envelope into their fire risk assessments?
So in this case, this is about a refurbishment. Has been applied and to facades that have been replaced. So this is focusing particularly on replacements. So a fire risk assessor would be reliant on fire safety information that they could obtain through the responsible person from the parties responsible for designing and installing that particular type of external wall.
And would you have expected the responsible person or the fire risk assessor, as the case may be, to be reasonably sufficiently experienced and trained to be able to carry out a proper assessment within the meaning of section paragraph 72.1?
Yeah. So I think for this circumstance where there's new materials, I'm going to assume they should be compliant with approved document B during design. in an ideal world, there should be a fire safety strategy that would provide some simple description of the performance, which should be enough, in my opinion, or else you would have to look at some of the basic component fire safety information yourself. Okay, but that has, I have to say, in an ideal world, because obviously there wasn't a prevalence of that information available in the spirit of balance. But there's kind of all different extremes when it comes to risk assessing cladding. I have to be very careful now. And I think there is a way where it can be quite simple if it's described adequately in a fire strategy document, instead of having to escalate into a scenario of detailed reviewing of a building manual or even having to do some kind of major inspection. But there should be sufficient paper-based information to enable you to understand the combustibility of the main components of the cladding.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Would it be enough for a fire risk assessor, when, using the words in 72.2, determining if the external surfaces of walls are satisfactory, simply to say that it had been signed off by building control? Absolutely
not, no. And I think, so if a person isn't skilled to review a certain level of detailed drawing, or doesn't have access to a fire strategy where it's explained, the safest thing to do and the most accurate thing to do is to explain the building has been reclad, that you cannot ascertain if it is a hazard or not, and you strongly advise the responsible person within a specific time frame that they urgently, through whatever means available to them, determine the materials that have been used in that refurbishment.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Can I then, just to back this up a little bit, go to the competency criteria again at CTA 703, please, page 73. And I'd like to look at this is a part of Appendix H.
Yeah.
And if we look together at Appendix H, fire protection, H1 on the right-hand side, passive fire protection. If you look a little bit lower down, it says there, under the heading passive fire protection, the fire risk assessor should have a knowledge and understanding of the role in the provision of fire safety, including the types of fire performance requirements, load-bearing capacity, integrity, insulation, reaction to fire performance, etc., of the following.
Yes.
And then if you go to page 74, in the final section on the left-hand side, the building envelope, for example, fire-resisting external curtain walls, significance of their role in protecting escape routes at boundaries, the significance of any immediately visible damage, and then a reference to sandwich panel constructions with a combustible insulating core. Does that reference there, in your opinion, support the idea that a fire risk assessor should be examining and forming a risk view about the hazards presented by the building envelope?
Yeah, so actually, yes, but also the text you showed me before you went to the building envelope, and you listed out load-bearing capacity,
page
insulation. Yeah, well, I'm sorry, I'm not.
No, we can flip the page back.
Yeah.
Let's go to
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes, page 7.
Because I think that's really important, actually. So it says the fire performance requirements, load-bearing capacity, integrity, insulation, reaction to fire performance. So in the approved document B, in the fire strategy, it should list the insulation and its performance, the reaction to fire performance, particularly when it comes to the external wall. And so there is a level of understanding needed of that fire safety provision, not necessarily a vastly in-depth understanding down to the tiny little gubbins that go into cladding, but that basic main component fire performance is written there, first of all. And then we go to your wall section on the other page.
Can we turn page, please? Page
Yeah.
74.
Yeah.
Bottom left.
So the significance of their role in protecting escape routes at boundaries, that's to do with escaping past a wall and it having to have fire-resisting properties, okay, which is different to reaction to fire properties. The significance of any immediately visible damage is relevant to sandwich panels used in external walls, because once they're damaged or have any kind of, it means the risk of ignition rises because the combustible material within them is exposed. So I see those two separate things, one about a fire-resisting wall and the other about a wall requiring reaction to fire performance, the classic external wall performance. Very helpful advice about considering those two things.
And how much would you need to know as a reasonably competent fire risk assessor about the requirements of approved document B section 12 and fire performance classifications?
How much would you need to know? Well, you need to know what the standard is.
I mean, for example, would you need to know whether or not your external wall complies with diagram 40?
Oh. Would you need to know if
in order to be able to discharge this obligation?
Because when a risk assessor is relying on the building, they have to understand its performance as the original fire safety provision. So yes, they do need to understand if it's a modern building. Yes, they need to have some understanding of the performance requirements, one of which is diagram 40. Yes.
Right. So therefore, would you expect the reasonably competent fire risk assessor to have sufficient training to be able to understand what it is he's looking at from that perspective?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly difficult to provide an adequate description of hazards without understanding fire safety provisions. So I think that means yes, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And in your experience in the industry generally, did fire risk assessors, your run-of-the-mill fire risk assessor, have that kind of training?
No.
Moving to April 2017, I just want to ask you a question about the LFB's approach in that year.
Yeah.
This is CST 403138, and it's the letter of the 6th of April 2017 from Assistant Commissioner Dan Daly to Chief Executives of London Boroughs.
Yeah.
It went widely. And it's entitled Tall Buildings External Fire Spread. It's a document, on this occasion, addressed to Laura Johnson at RBKC, but it went, as I say, widely, and it's a document we've looked at a number of times in the course of phase 2 of this inquiry. Can we go to the second page of this letter, please, the last paragraph, first two sentences? Assistant Commissioner Daly says this: I would therefore strongly urge that you consider this issue as part of the risk assessment process for premises under your control. I suggest that you make sure all relevant information about any replacement window and facade schemes is fully available to fire risk assessors. Now, first, do you agree with the approach urged by Assistant Commissioner Daly here?
Yes, I do. I think it's another, just as the LGA provides helpful information about the hazard a wall can pose, I think this is a very sensible letter warning people about a hazard emanating from the materials being used by the construction industry.
Yes. Are you able, from what you know, from your experience at the time, rather than reading documents in the inquiry, to explain the basis on which Mr. Daly formed the view and told Laura Johnson that fire risk assessors should be assessing the fire safety of facade schemes?
Well, I mean, I don't know why. I don't think I've ever met Mr. Daly, and I don't know why he wrote this letter. But I think this is 2017, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And I've made it clear to you that from 2013, my own personal experience was the prevalent use of those materials and a rising sense of concern in certain parts. In my experience about insulation, but in other, I was aware of other people's concerns about materials beyond insulation. So if I had read that letter on the day, it would simply have reflected
Your view.
That moment in time, yeah.
How in practice at the time would fire risk assessors address the information set out in Mr. Daly's letter? What would a fire risk assessor do? Do you know?
Well, I know what they should do,
What's
but I mean,
that?
I've never spoken to someone who did do it, if that's what you're asking me.
Well,
Yeah.
that's helpful, but
Yeah.
can you tell us
No.
in brief, what they should do?
Yeah, well, I think I kind of tried to explain that in chapter 10. So it depends on the number of buildings. I've explained about what KCTMO did and Mr. Stokes did, but it's because a lot of this ends up becoming about information, making sure you have the information to determine if it's a hazard or not. And then if you don't have the information, my reading of the letter was a warning that you needed to go about getting that information and therefore be in a position to confirm if that hazard existed in the building the responsible person was responsible for. So it was about information and taking the time to starting to categorise, starting to understand if that hazard existed in your portfolio or building or if it did not.
Yes.
And, there was nothing unsensible, short, medium and long-term actions to address the risk. So it was about preparation and understanding and then taking sensible steps to resolve a hazard if a hazard was found.
Thank you. Can I then turn to the next topic, which is gathering information, arising out of your last answer, in fact, but a different topic. Would you expect the responsible person to be sufficiently familiar with its obligations under the RRO, as identified in the relevant guidance, to know that it had to provide the fire risk assessor with all up-to-date information relevant to the FRA that they are about to undertake?
Would I expect that?
Yeah,
Yes, I would,
you
yes.
And you would expect that, would you, in just the same way as if it were carrying out the risk assessment itself in-house?
Oh, absolutely, because you can't do a suitable and sufficient risk assessment without information.
No. Now, can I show you what Janice Ray said on day 142, please? I'd like to go to day 142, page 135. I just want to show you some of her evidence at lines 6 to 10. Day 142, page 135. And at line 6, she's asked, do you recall whether before or after his visit to carry out a fire risk assessment, Mr. Stokes ever asked you for up-to-date information about disabled persons at Grenfell Tower? And her answer, I don't recall him asking me. And then if you go a few pages on to page 137 on day 142, page 137, at line 14, question, I think from your earlier evidence this morning, but just confirm, it's right, isn't it, that you never actually considered telling Carl Stokes that before he carried out each FRA, or rather when you gave him the list of FRAs to do, you never told him about the number of vulnerable residents that the TMO had identified in those buildings? Answer, I don't believe I did. No. And why is that? It was clearly a major oversight. I can't give you any other explanation. I'm sorry. Now, just on that evidence, if a fire risk assessor in the position of Carl Stokes wasn't given the information that we looked at with Miss Ray there, would you have expected them to ask for it?
Yes.
Yes. And if not given it despite asking for it, What would you expect a fire risk assessor to do about it?
Produce a risk assessment on the basis of a clear explanation of what information they had and what information they did not have and the consequences of the missing information. So a clear explanation of the information forming the basis of the risk assessment.
And the consequences of not having that information.
Yeah, so I mean, we've jumped from cladding to, in this particular case, regarding vulnerable residents in Grenfell Tower.
Yes, it's an example.
As an example, there were statements made as if information had been considered quite thoroughly, actually, when that's not the case, as we now know.
And we'll come to that.
Yeah.
But look, I'm using that as an example here. Would it be normally accepted practice for the responsible person to rely on the fire risk assessor, the appointed fire risk assessor, to identify information needed for them to complete the fire risk assessment?
Yeah, I think so, because sometimes people aren't quite sure what it is that you need to do your job properly for them. So there's an exchange at the start. That's my experience. We would issue a list of documents as a minimum we require before we start. And if they're not available, something has to be done. Sometimes that means the inspection you do has to be well beyond the inspection of a classic risk assessment, because there is no other information to rely on.
Right.
So I see it as two ways. Is that okay? I think it's the responsible person and the risk assessor together need to come to a conclusion on the information forming the basis of the risk assessment.
Right. Would it follow from that, perhaps it doesn't, that where the fire risk assessor doesn't ask for information or advise that he should be given information relevant to the fire risk assessment, then the responsible person can safely assume that it's unnecessary or irrelevant?
Safely assume. So I don't think a competent fire risk assessor should conduct themselves like that. If they do, I have some sympathy with the responsible person, but I would expect the person representing, I'm thinking about Grenfell Tower particularly now, I would expect the person representing the responsible person there to be very familiar with the information required. They had a warning before, as we know now.
Yes. Yes. Are you referring... Well, what are you referring to?
I'm referring to the Salvas audit, where they set out really clearly that each building in KCTMO's property needed its own fire safety file, or they might have used a different word. There's just a basic level of information any person responsible for a building needs, for maintenance purpose, risk assessment purposes, all different purposes.
Well, we'll come back to the September 2009 Salvas report later in your evidence. Can I then ask you some questions about frequency? We can proceed, I think, on the basis that Article 9.3 of the RRO requires that fire risk assessments should be reviewed regularly so as to keep it up to date.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And particularly if there's a reason to suspect that it's no longer valid or there's been a significant change.
Yes.
Yes. Now, can I just show you BLARP 25027, page 139, paragraph 8.2.23 of your report at Chapter 8. And here it is that you address the TMO's arrangements for carrying out reviews of their fire risk assessments and new fire risk assessments, as set out in section 14.3 of their fire safety strategy of November 2013. And you quote from it there. And if you go over the page in this report to page 140, you set out at the very top of the page, still within paragraph 8.2.24, paragraph 14.3.4, which says the FRA will usually set out the timescale within which the regular review will be required, generally for properties assessed by us as being potentially high risk. This will be required on an annual basis. We would aim to carry out a new FRA on a 3-yearly basis. And if you look below that, you say at 8.2.25, in my opinion, these arrangements, if properly implemented, would adequately enable compliance with Article 9 of the RRFSO. Now, Mr. Todd says that it's commonly considered that the best practice is for FRAs for most buildings to be reviewed annually. Just for our reference, that's paragraph 3.25 of his main report. Do you agree with him?
Sorry, I thought you were talking about the new on the 3 yearly, so we're on review now. So I think a new FRA on a 3 yearly basis, I'm aware that that was actually quite common practice, though I've always thought it should be 2, and a review every year in high-rise residential buildings, I would agree, is adequate, yes.
Yes. Now, we know for a fact that the FRAs for Grenfell Tower were done irregularly, at irregular intervals. So September 2009, December 2010, November 2012, October 2014, and April and June 2016.
Yes.
Would, in your opinion, would the fire risk assessment trade regard those frequencies as regular?
For a full fire risk assessment?
Yes.
Or, so I think every 2 years for a full fire risk assessment is quite common. Doing a review in between is also common.
And I see. So you agree that if there'd been spot checks annually, by the TMO to ensure that FRA actions were being completed, that would be, is it right? Is it your opinion that that would be regarded as satisfying?
It could be if everything is happening, if the actions are being closed out and things are being done thoroughly, yes. I wouldn't criticise that timing, no, on its own.
Right.
But it's the effectiveness of what's done each year and the effectiveness of the full risk assessment every 2 years.
Yes.
But I wouldn't criticise a really well done system like that simply because of time, no.
I see. So you don't criticise the frequency within...
No.
For Grenfell Tower?
I don't. I haven't criticised the frequency of every 2 years, no.
Now, can I ask you then to look at the same part of this report at page 425, paragraph 17.8.1, still within chapter 8, paragraph 17.8.1, you say, and this is under the heading, Mr. Stokes' understanding of the preventive and protective measures in Grenfell Tower after handover. You say, finally, KCTMO as responsible person had a critical activity once the primary refurbishment works were complete. And that was to ensure a fire risk assessment for Grenfell Tower was carried out, capturing the effect of the new works and formulating the resulting general fire precautions by means of a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. And then at 17.8.2, once practical completion occurred in July 2016, this was a moment in time, based on my own professional experience, to carry out a thorough fire risk assessment, taking into account all the new systems, fixtures and fittings in Grenfell Tower. Yeah. And then over the top of the page, to page 427, we can go to that 2 pages on, you say there at paragraph 17.8.8, yet the evidence shows that Mr. Stokes only provided a summary update to his previous fire risk assessment documents in June 2016 only. Now, just to be clear, if we can, is it your opinion that Carl Stokes should have been instructed to carry out a new FRA on Grenfell Tower after practical completion in July 2016?
Yes.
And not earlier than 20th of June 2016, when he was in fact instructed?
If the KCTMO thought they had another reason for doing a risk assessment at that time, I understand there may have been some other reason. But in terms of the final condition of the building, it needed to also occur after practical completion.
Can you explain why?
Because there was so much work done in Grenfell Tower to passive and active protection measures. It wasn't possible to rely on old descriptions or theoretically old drawings, but as we know, there's no evidence that drawings were used anyway. So there was a need to understand the performance of all the new active and passive systems and record them and explain how they would be relied upon in the event of a fire. I mean, are you asking me in the sense of review versus full or just the timing?
I'm asking you full.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because so many things have changed. You know,
Yeah.
the smoke control system, there was all sorts of things had changed, were different, required consideration.
Yeah. And when you say he only provided a summary update to his
Yeah.
previous fire risk assessment, which was April 2016,
Yeah.
why do you say that it was only a summary update?
Because it didn't explain the resulting protective measures from the refurbishment works
Right.
and how, what was meant to happen or not with respect to the tower. Okay.
I see. And in your opinion, should Carl Stokes have told Janice Ray that a new FRA was needed after completion of the refurbishment?
Yes, I think he should have known that and raised it, yes, and equally, Miss Ray, the responsible person, should know that. And it's something that's actually quite commonly documented as well, if one didn't know.
Thank you. Can I then turn to a different topic, which is FRA actions?
Yeah.
And I just want to ask you first about the general recording of risk in action plans.
Yeah.
We can stick within Chapter 8 of your report where we are and go, please, back to page 184. And at page 184, paragraphs 9.1.14 and 15, you say this: the most significant purpose of a fire risk assessment is to estimate the level of risk and provide clear guidance on any actions required or to reduce or maintain that level of risk as trivial or tolerable.
Yeah.
Mr. Stokes did not explain or record the purpose of any action derived by him as a result of his risk assessment as being relevant to the control of a specific hazard. By this I mean he did not record how any action or a failure to complete any specific action would impact the risk level for the premises. Now, a number of questions flow from that. First, should the connection between each risk and each action be explained one by one in the main body of a fire risk assessment?
Yeah, yes, I think so. Yes.
Yes. Can you just explain why it was important for a fire risk assessor to do that?
Because it helps the responsible person understand which actions are a risk, which actions are the most serious risk to life or not, and a timed programme of work can be developed between them. Because a specific identified risk may pose, say a very high level of harm to the relevant people, but may not be something that can be dealt with very honestly and practically in the short term. Okay? So that's why the risk levels of each one, it's important to understand them, and then the timing possible practically and honestly of each one, they need to be separated. And so a sensible action plan exists on the record, and a sensible risk level can be agreed for that moment, and how it will change for the building as you move through closing out your actions. So I see it as quite dynamic.
Is that a reason why one shouldn't do a risk assessment generically or cumulatively?
Generically, I'm sorry, I don't actually know what you mean by that.
But why would, okay, let me try it a different way. Would it be reasonable for a fire risk assessor to lump all the risks together and then produce a generic risk assessment or a cumulative risk assessment?
You mean a final risk level? No, because I don't agree with that, because the whole point of bringing risk assessments into the fire space in the first place was for the responsible person to have a more active part in controlling risk in the building. It's an ongoing matter. In a way, it never ends. And they have to have clear help about, what can happen in the short, medium and in long term, and what risk they continue to carry until those actions are closed out. Because if a specific hazard can cause significant harm, but you genuinely can't fix that, let's say it's going to take you 3 years to fix it, The responsible person has to understand that they are carrying that risk, and that risk exists to the relevant people in their building, and they have to make a decision if they're prepared to accept that risk level,
Yes.
or they're going to do something else in the interim. Sorry.
No, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. You've explained it very, very fully, I think. Now, if we go on, please, in this report to page 206, and let's look together at paragraph 9.8.18. You say there, his failure, that's Mr. Stokes, you say his failure to connect the actions required to a potential consequence for the relevant persons in his technical method, and more importantly, his failure to communicate the connection to consequences in his documentation was a significant one.
Yeah.
Now, just again, a clarificatory question from me. Are you saying that Mr. Stokes should have spelt out to the TMO the particular possible consequences of not taking each of the remedial actions that he was advising should be taken?
Yeah, because risk is formulated from two parameters, probability and consequence. So by assigning a risk level to each hazard, that's basically what you're doing.
I see.
So he needed to explain that. When you step right back and think about Grenfell Tower, the KCTMO were in a position where it was tolerable every year, and sometimes 90% of their actions were high priority. Okay, and I think I would like to be a bit clear about that. If you're a responsible person and you have a building stock where everything is apparently high priority all the time, you need to sit down and actually understand, what does that really mean? How much risk am I carrying here? And how much risk am I causing to my relevant persons? Okay, so that's why splitting the risk level for the different types of hazard one finds. Some of them are quite trivial, some of them can be very serious, and then formulating action plans and measuring oneself on a sensible action plan is my understanding of what the order was asking everybody to do.
I see. And from the TMO's perspective, is it right that it would gain from a risk by risk approach rather than a cumulative approach enough information to be able to understand the probability and the consequence,
Exactly.
so that it could decide in an informed way whether to accept that risk?
Exactly, and that's a really important part, a really important outcome from a risk assessment.
Yes, I see.
Okay.
Can I then turn to the question of timescales for FRA actions? And let's start with PAS 79, which is at CTA 703, please, page 59. This is the commentary in PAS 79 to clause 19.2. And if we look at the left-hand side of the page there it is, you can see Roman 2 there. And it says, in formulating an action plan for premises in which the fire risk has been assessed as unacceptably high, the analytical approach to fire risk assessment permits backtracking to determine whether in effect the problem arises from inadequate fire prevention, i.e. inadequate means for control or elimination of fire hazards, inadequate fire protection, e.g. unsatisfactory means of escape or fire warning systems, shortcomings in fire safety management, or a combination of them.
Yes, yeah.
Now, focusing on shortcomings in fire safety management there, how would you expect a reasonably competent fire risk assessor, or rather a fire risk assessor aiming to produce a reasonably competent fire risk assessment, to assess shortcomings in fire safety management?
So, first of all, they have to understand the arrangements in place. And then, in the position Mr. Stokes was in, where he had the benefit of inspecting so many premises, he had the practical means to understand how those arrangements were being implemented in very many buildings, including Grenfell Tower. So I would expect a review of the arrangements as the responsible person planned or understood them to be, and then one's observations in practice of what was really happening in the building. And that, you can work that out from, say, the repetitiveness of a defect or not. And there's other signs in a building that the arrangements are being consistently implemented or not.
I see. And what kinds of shortcomings, if you could just give us an example, what kinds of shortcomings in fire safety management would you expect a fire risk assessor aiming to produce a reasonably competent assessment to identify?
What kind of shortcomings? Okay, well,
It's an open-ended question, I accept, but can you give us some examples?
I'll give you some examples. So the routine inspections of critical fire safety systems don't appear to be happening,
Right.
or the quality of fire door, say, closing and closer seems to be deteriorating with time. So either changes in the protective measures relied upon, or consistent failures to inspect them, something like that.
Thank you. That's helpful. Does the paragraph that we're looking at tell us, and we can read it and work it out, but does it tell us that a fire risk assessor should work back from the problem to the source of the problem and to work out whether one of the reasons for the problem, which leads to the unacceptably high risk, is defects in the fire safety management system?
Yeah, and that's exactly why you deal with each hazard in turn, because some of them may be a one-off, and if the responsible person, you just say, look, that just can never happen again, or some of them will be caused by either an absence of something in the management system or the failure to do something properly. So that's why splitting them out is so important. And again, it means then the responsible person can do a sensible action plan. What's the wrong in my organisation versus what's the problem with the type of fire door I've installed. So it's a very broad range of issues that cause risk levels to rise in a building.
And you're saying, I think, from your answer a minute or two ago, that a fire risk assessor in the position of Carl Stokes, who had a view of very many buildings within his instructions, was in a better position to form a clear view about fire safety management.
Yeah, I mean, he's in my mind, he was in a great position, because one of the really useful things when you're doing a risk assessment is actually getting to talk to people who have responsibilities day to day. And by my experience, also talking to residents. And you get to hear about the reality of things as opposed to the nice policy written on the paper. And Mr. Stokes got to see all different types of properties, got to meet all different types of people, and he could form he should have been able to form a really thorough view on how the organisational arrangements were genuinely being implemented in each property.
Yes. Can we then stick with this page of past 79 and look at Roman 3 on this page in the left-hand column? It says, the action plan is an inventory of actions normally prioritised and time-restrained to devise, maintain or improve controls. When it says time-restrained, what do you take that to mean there?
So time-restrained means there's a start and finish date, right. And that's relevant to this issue of risk acceptance, which I think is a very important point to bring out.
Yes. So what would you say was the purpose of adding a timescale, a time limit?
Because that risk may only be suitable to carry for a very specific period of time.
Yes. And with the time...
And to ensure, also to ensure, that you can't carry the risk longer than that time frame. And if I come back and find it again, now we're entering into very different territory, because it means your fire safety management system is not able to close out these issues when they're notified to you. So that's the point of having these deadlines. but the deadlines being sensible as a function of the hazard.
Yeah. So the deadline, it would be an indication, would it, of the gravity of or the seriousness of the risk?
The seriousness of the risk and the practicality of dealing with the risk, because some risks are extraordinarily complex to deal with.
Now, on that note, would a fire risk assessor normally take account of the expense of the remedial action when recommending a deadline?
When recommending a deadline, in my mind, the deadlines I work with the responsible person to derive deadlines for very complex issues, and complexity can be driven by cost constraints as one parameter driving complexity, yes.
And what about complexity of the remedy?
Yeah, but that's what I mean. So the remedy may be very expensive and time consuming, and so it has to be planned out as a function of budget, availability, etc.
Right.
Yeah.
I see. And that would produce a particular risk. And then the question is this right for the responsible person is whether that risk should be carried for that period or whether there should be some mitigation measure.
So then if you've agreed, the earliest I can get this thing sorted out is 3 years, but you've told me it's causing, let's say, medium to high harm. It may cause medium to high harm to the people in my building. It might be for that 3-year period, you need to introduce another control into the building until that particular action is closed out.
Yes, thank you. And if you look, please, at Roman 4, a little bit lower down the screen. If you can just scroll up to see the rest of Roman 4 on the same page in past 79, item C there. And also Roman 5 on the right-hand side of the page, I'll show you in a moment. It says that the FRA must opt for the most cost-effective solution. The question, has the most cost-effective solution been chosen? And if you go to Roman 5 on the right-hand side of the page, it also makes the same point there in the second sentence. The fire precautions proposed ought to be the most cost-effective available. Would that mean that an otherwise urgent remedial action should get a longer period for cure for purely financial reasons?
Sorry, say that last
Yes.
again, sorry.
Does the reference there to looking for the most cost-effective solution possible mean that it would be reasonable for the responsible person or the FRA to allocate a longer period for remedy for financial reasons on what is otherwise an urgent remedial action?
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. You see, what does cost-effective mean? I mean, anyway, sorry. So cost-effective is more than how much cash I'm going to spend. I mean, in my mind, in a risk assessment, it has to be balanced with consequences. Okay?
Yeah.
So there will be different ways to solve a problem. You see, we have to be careful about what problem we mean. But if that's meant to read, and I don't read it that way, that you must always pick the cheapest solution, I don't agree. Cost-effective has other parameters associated with it. If an action can cause extreme harm and it's genuinely going to take a few years to resolve, then other control measures will be required and they will have cost associated with them.
I see. Can we then look at Mr. Stokes's timescale in his action plans for Grenfell Tower in December 2010 and November 2012? First, CST 403165, page 1. This is his 29th of December 2010 action plan. And if you look at page 1 there, you can see that his timescales there are high, 2 to 3 weeks, medium, 1 to 2 months, low, 3 to 6 months. You see that?
Yeah.
And then if we go to the November 2012 action plan, at CST 403083, page 1, you can see there that they are now high, 2 to 3 weeks, medium 2 to 3 months, low 6 to 12 months. So the medium and low have been extended out a bit, from 1 to 2 months to 2 to 3 months, and from 3 to 6 months to 6 to 12 months. those changes there in the medium and the high, medium and low, were those timescales recommended by any government guidance or any version of PAS 79 that you know about?
Yeah, like I think the government, some of the guidance documents suggest some time frames, yes. But I think they're all very clear that, my understanding of them is they're still quite clear that they're not, everything can't fit into those timescales.
No.
Okay.
Perhaps we're slightly cross purposes. Mr. Stokes told us, for our references, this is at day 137, at page 34 and 36, that he'd got the 2010 timescales from the sleeping guide and the 2012 timescales from the LGA guide.
Yeah.
We're not sure we can find those there.
That's correct.
Can you help
yeah.
us whether he's right about that?
No, I don't know how we would find them.
Right.
Yeah.
So you don't know about that.
Yeah.
Are timescales or were timescales routinely something for the decision of the individual fire risk assessor on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, like that would be my understanding. I mean, some risk assessors have a today band, so they say before we leave today, this has to be resolved. So, I think there are no rules on timing for the very good reason the hazards. It depends what's happening in the building.
I see. Are you able to help us on whether there is any government guidance at all or any other document which would have prompted a change in the timescales between December 2010 and November 2012?
I don't know. I haven't thought about that. I'm really sorry. I'll have to go and read. I didn't think about the change, and I didn't check if it came from somewhere.
Right. Well,
so I can't answer that question.
Right. Mr. Todd told us that he wasn't aware of any such.
Yeah. Like I'm not aware day to day. But I'm not aware of a change in the rules for timing because there are no rules for timing.
Right.
Can I just ask, do you have any comment on what might appear to be a rather mechanistic way of setting these time limits? I mean, I understood the force of what you said about making the responsible person aware of the risk that's being carried and so on. That would suggest that each risk ought to be considered individually and a timescale for its remedy being based on the nature and severity of that risk.
That's correct.
Which is rather inconsistent with having a sort of separate blocks like this. But is this the common way of doing it?
So I agree with you fully, and that's why we do them individually. Okay. I think there are examples of time limits to get actions closed out in other people's risk assessments. Yes, but there are time limits. But I think I said earlier, I mean, over 90% of Mr. Stokes' actions on Grenfell Tower were high priority, all the time, and that's where this system falls down without thinking about the individual risk items.
I mean, one might have thought that there would be a process of consultation in that the fire risk assessor would say, I've discovered this problem.
Exactly.
I think it ought to be done fairly soon.
Yes.
Then have a discussion with the responsible person about the nature of the risk. And
exactly.
either agree on a time limit or if the responsible person doesn't agree with the fire risk assessor, he notes his advice and
exactly, and that's exactly what we do. And I've had plenty of arguments with people about timing, and that's when cost comes in. And this is why this whole thing about risk acceptance is so important. We might say, we strongly advise you to get this thing done in 2 years. The responsible person would say, you just don't understand, I cannot get it done in less than 4 years, okay, for whatever reason. And you have to describe that, and you say, if you go past 2 years, we strongly advise you to implement this control mechanism. Responsible persons will say no or sack you if there's agreement can't be reached, okay? So it is a very interactive process. It should be between the responsible person and the risk assessor, and for the KCTMO, with the Grenfell Tower and what it was part of, that was something that could have been enormously beneficial to them.
Right, thank you very much. So I'm sorry I rather interrupted your flow, Mr. Millett, but it may be that that's a point at which we could interrupt it overnight.
We could. It gives rise to a number of questions which will take about 5 minutes to finish off the line, but we've gone past the hour and I can happily do it in the morning. And we're making good progress.
Are we?
Yes.
Yes. Well, you probably wouldn't mind stopping at this
That's
point,
fine,
would you?
yeah.
All right, well, we'll stop there for the afternoon. We'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow, please, and we'll see you then. Thank you. Right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Millett. I'm sorry if I rather
No, not at all.
truncated your question.
No,
you can come back to it with a fresh
Yes.
eye tomorrow.
Yes, no, thank you very much.
Thank you. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please. Thank you.